Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I know some folks are still settling in here. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Asia Society. And while people are settling in, Christine Davies, this is for you. I was very afraid that I was going to forget this mention, so the best way to deal with it is just to do it right away. A late add to the notes for tonight. Some of you may have seen this on your way in. If not, you will take care to see it on your way out. It's a brochure about this auditorium. It's actually a serious note. So we are very blessed to have this amazing space in which we hold all these great events. We are also very mindful, and others have occasionally, it might be some of you who have made us mindful, that this space is in need of a little sprucing up. So we are starting today a campaign to spruce the place up a little bit. And in this little brochure, you will see, if you don't have it already on your way out, a few ways in which you can help support us. And if you are so inclined, I think some of the seats, but very few, have on the backs enshrined for immortality the names of those who have supported this before. If you'd like to join them, there are 258 seats in this auditorium. They'll be better, and the auditorium will be better for your help and support, and we really would appreciate it. Again, ask any of the ushers on the way out if you are so inclined. Again, good evening and welcome to the Asia Society. We have, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say one of the more fascinating events we're likely to have this season tonight. Just a couple of words of welcome. We have here not only a great many Asia Society members and patrons, but also trustees, too many to mention. I do want to just call out our Vice Chair, Lulu Wong, who is with us, our President and CEO, Josette Sheeran, who is here, but also I'm going to embarrass or call out one other trustee because this is the week when this particular Asia Society trustee ends a remarkable and long 12-year tenure at PepsiCo. Please, a warm welcome to the CEO for a couple of more days and Chair of PepsiCo, Ms. Indra Nooyi. Welcome. So we're pivoting tonight away from what was, for those of you who were with us, a very busy and hectic week of UN General Assembly programs last week. We had a nice parade of Asian leaders in here throughout the period. Tonight's guest, you'll hear more about him in a moment, is a global leader of a different kind, really a great voice in the world of high tech and artificial intelligence, or AI in particular, Kai-Fu Lee. Before we get started and before we applaud for him, just a couple of words about upcoming events here at the Asia Society in New York. We are 2 weeks into our season of India, which has launched with great fanfare a couple of weeks ago. The hallmark of that season is the exhibition upstairs in our galleries. It's called The Progressive Revolution, Modern Art for a New India. It's great, but as I've been saying from this podium, you don't have to take my word for it. It continues to get great reviews, including just the other day in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal as well. We hope you'll have time to visit, and there is, under that Season of India banner, a slate of public programs in the policy and arts and business spaces. This Thursday, the latest of those, 2 writers from the Indian diaspora here in this country, Hari Kunzru and Bali Jaswal, will be here. That is Thursday night. And a special mention that on October the 9th, we honor our 2018 Asia Game Changer Award winners. The main event, if you will, is downtown at the Cipriani Broadway space, but we also hold a public event on this stage that afternoon, and it's a chance to engage in a different way with the honorees. Indra Nooyi, you're going to get another mention now. You're probably bracing for it. Indra Nooyi is our Game Changer of the Year this year. She will be with us for a conversation on leadership, but so will some of the other honorees. The girls from the Afghan girls robotics team, who've been in the headlines both for some interesting trauma they had trying to get into this country, but also, and more importantly, for all the contests that they have won here and in other parts of the world. And also from Thailand, we just confirmed that several of the key people involved in that crazy, miraculous story from the summer in those caves in northern Thailand will be here. The coach who kept those boys alive in the cave, one of the boys from the team, and also the Thai official who helped run the rescue effort. That's all here on the 9th of October on the stage in the afternoon, and then the more fancy event in the evening downtown. Okay, for tonight and tonight's speaker, I said to our guest a moment ago, we're not usually in the habit of doing book reviews from this stage, but I'm going to make an exception, and that's why I have it up here. It's a while since I've read a book that is both as interesting, taught me as much, and also a page-turner, which is not something you would normally think of, at least I wouldn't, when the subject is, as the title says, AI, Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. I also told Kai-Fu Lee that my wife gets irritated when I dog-ear books too excessively, and I do that just because I find a page kind of interesting. This book is dog-eared start to finish. It's super interesting. I'll just share a couple of nuggets that won't spoil anything either for tonight's event or for those of you who are going to read it. Kai-Fu Lee believes AI has given China what he calls its Sputnik moment. He notes that money for AI startups is pouring in to China, not only from venture capitalists, but also from the Chinese government itself. Chinese leaders, he says, are engineering a, quote, brute force transformation in the space. As for the United States, he says, quote, Silicon Valley looks downright sluggish compared to its competitor across the Pacific. And as far as government is concerned, he notes that when the Obama administration announced a set of recommendations on this, not only did that not galvanize this country in anything like the way it did in China, the Trump administration soon after proposed cuts in funding for AI research. Kai-Fu Lee believes both the US and China and the rest of the world are going to get hit very hard, I think this is a common view, by the job losses that may come with all this transformation. And apart from that, and apart from the competition between the great powers, you have all kinds of fascinating glimpses into the brave new world that AI will bring. And again, I may be a neophyte to this, but my favorite was his story about a supermarket in our not too distant future, or maybe China's not too distant future, where you walk in, facial recognition, they know who you are. They've got sensors and all the rest in your refrigerator in your home, so they know what you want. They know your diet, they know your plans for the week, and so they guide you accordingly, and you have no human interaction whatsoever. And lastly, in terms of this little book review, Kai-Fu Lee writes very eloquently, beautifully, about A Brush with Mortality, a recent one that has changed his attitudes towards all of this. You have his bio, I think. You may know it already. I'll just note Kai-Fu Lee moved from Taiwan to Tennessee when he was all of 11 years old. He earned a PhD in AI back in the 1980s. I don't know how many people were even studying AI back then. He worked for Apple, Microsoft, and Google, and ultimately went to run Google in China. And he now runs Sinovation, a venture capital fund that focuses in this space. Delighted also to have with us as moderator Andrew McLaughlin, who knows a thing or two about the subject. Andrew is co-founder of Higher Ground Labs and the executive director of the SAI Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale University. Andrew McLaughlin served in the Obama White House as Deputy Chief Technology Officer, responsible for advising the president on internet technology and innovation policy. How this will go, we'll get right to a conversation on the stage. We'll have time for your questions before we're done. As always, those of you watching beyond the room, we are webcasting this program. You can email your questions to moderator@asiasociety.org or tweet them using the hashtag for this event, AsiaSocietyLive. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please a warm Asia Society welcome for Andrew McLaughlin and Kai-Fu Lee.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm going to start off with a kind of an echo of Tom and confess that I'm coming up on 50 now, and I'm getting to that age where friends are writing books, and they're very often painful to read, and you have to sort of like express your enthusiasm in a kind of a manufactured way. But I had the same reaction as Tom. I loved this book. I thought it was great. It was a lot of distilled wisdom, and in some ways, I feel like I'm kind of like your target demographic. And we should just say, as a matter of personal history,
Yes.
I feel like this is a kind of like a military unit buddy that I'm getting back together with, because the process of, we both worked together on getting Google into China. That was, I have to say, one of the most difficult business problems that I've ever seen teams tackle. It was incredibly stressful and difficult.
And then you just left me there.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. I mean, I don't know. You get the home leave. You take the home leave. But so I'm going to take this conversation a little bit out of the order of the book. And what I want to do for the benefit of the audience in particular is to start off with a basic understanding of what we mean by AI.
Okay.
Let's talk about the technology. And in particular, can you help us understand what it was about 2006, 2007, 2008? What is the big thing that changed that has made this technology that you've been working on basically your entire adult life now a significant force in the world?
Sure. Well, it's really a real pleasure to be here. I've been working on AI for 38 years, since my sophomore year. The first 33 of which ended up with basically no output because AI was premature. And two things happened in the last 5 to 10 years. One was the invention of a technology called deep learning. And what deep learning is a way for an electronic brain can take huge amounts of data and given objective functions. That is, you tell it to do something. It's humanly created objective functions. It can train itself on massive amounts of data and reach superhuman performance. But with a couple of caveats. One, you have to have huge amounts of data. And two, it works only in a single domain and cannot cross domains. And three, you have to tell it what the right answer is so that it can learn. So feed it 1 billion faces and tell the system each one who is Andrew, John, and so on. Or feed it a lot of speech, or feed it a lot of Amazon clicks, and which ones led to buying, which ones didn't. Or feed it a lot of video taken from a car and have it learn when you should turn left or right. So it's outcome-based tagging that gives deep learning huge amount of feedback for it to learn to do something for an environment, for a situation that it hasn't seen before. So unlike what you would intuit, the human does not go in and say, okay, you're recognizing Andrews, he's got these glasses, they're black, and they're round shaped like this. You don't do that at all. You just show enough pictures of Andrew and let the system figure it out. So the magical thing is, the thing kind of programs itself. Of course, you need some AI scientists to tweak things, and that it achieves superhuman accuracy. So we've seen this applied to AlphaGo, beating the human world champion. We've seen it applied to face recognition. Face recognition systems can recognize 3 million people. None of us can probably do 3,000. Speech recognition is now exceeding human recognition accuracy, and then recognizing a cancer, certain types of cancer MRIs better than radiologists. So this will continue, but keep in mind, it only works in a single domain, cannot cross domains.
So one big thing that changed that enabled what we now understand deep learning to be able to do is there's a lot of computing power in the world that is networked and very cheap.
Right.
The second thing is that computing power and the proliferation of sensors in our phones, in our lives, in many different ways, produced oceans of data.
Yep.
A third ingredient, though, is a technique known as a neural net. Can you help us understand how a neural net works and what it is that was new and innovative about it?
Yeah, so neural nets are at the center of deep learning. Deep learning is basically a way to train neural nets. So think of neural nets as think of it as a gigantic spreadsheet-like thing, and you feed it tons of data, and then you click a button and answer comes out. Okay, so just like you do your quarterly reports, you feed it all the salaries and income and profit and all that, click, your EPS comes out. The difference is you actually have to program your Excel spreadsheet. This deep learning says this is an Excel spreadsheet that requires no programming. Just feed it enough data and tell us each case what the answer should be, and it figures out all the middle magic. And deep learning is deep in the sense that it has thousands of layers, and there's a mathematical algorithm that will teach the system to train itself and optimize the outcome. So if we want to do a face recognition system, we would feed it a lot of faces with tags. This is Andrew, this is John. And then the system will continue to iterate until it feels like it can do no better. And when it's done, it's optimizing on the objective function, maximize human face recognition rate. So it's directly maximizing something that the human can tell it to do given the tagging. Also, I want to comment on the data and the computation. I want to give an excuse why my PhD thesis didn't change the world. I did my PhD thesis in 1988. It was by far, at the time, the best speech recognition system that existed. It was so good that people didn't believe me. I had to publish the open source code and all the data to prove that it was actually real. However, and also, I had a huge amount of data. I had the world's largest database in 1986, and it was 100 megabytes. It's 5 songs, right? But back then, that cost $100,000 for my advisor. I mean, that was worth 2 houses in Pittsburgh, where I did my thesis. So now you can imagine how much more data we have. I mean, speech recognition companies probably use 100T. So now that's a million times more computation. Similarly, a million times more storage. Similarly, computation probably went up just as much. And it was really the combination of a lot of compute, a lot of data, and this deep learning algorithm that made this breakthrough possible, invented about 10 years ago, starting to see traction about 5 years ago, and now it is the hottest thing everywhere.
So let's take the example of a bank loan officer. And let's talk about how AI might replicate or supplant that function. So a bank loan officer gets a loan application, and then using human judgment with probably a rule book, tries to make a decision about whether this is a good candidate for a loan, bad candidate for a loan. How would AI tackle that situation?
Actually, we invested in such a company, so I'll describe the company. The company also takes a lot of input, but the input is a lot more than what's filled on the forms. It requires a form, your address, name, social security number, but in the case of the company we funded, it's an app for a loan. And you download the app, you fill out the things that you would have filled out for the loan app, and it also asks for your permission to transmit up information from your phone. But not to worry too much, it's at the same level that Android allows Facebook, Snapchat, Google, YouTube to take. Nothing more than that. So it takes all that information and is fed into a network that was trained on basically millions of people who've previously used the app and borrowed the money. And there was an app, rather than teaching abstract concepts on this is trustworthy or not, it is trained on the very fact whether you return the money or not. So millions of people, let's say 1 million people borrowed money, let's say 900,000 returned the money, then the system learns we want to lend money to more like people like those 900,000. The 100,000 who didn't return the money defaulted, ran away, because it's just an app. It trained, don't lend more money to people like that. And then the system basically determines, trains itself to minimize default rates.
So one of the interesting things about the way AI works in that context is that factors which to a human would be ludicrous to take into consideration, how much battery life is left on your phone, let's say, what day of the week it is, what time of day you applied, what altitude you're at, who knows. Things which are absolutely not causally related to the outcome that we want might actually prove to have what you refer to as weak features. In other words, there are strong indicators, weak indicators, and what the AI can do that no human could do is make effective use of those weak indicators.
Exactly. I mean, we think they're not causally related, but actually they are. Otherwise, AI would have ignored them. So all the things you transmit up the phone are fed to the deep learning. And when you have 1 million pieces of data, the system will learn what's causally related and what's not. What we think is irrelevant. So as an example, the day of the month is quite important. And I can explain to you why. The reason is if it's close to a payday, then it is likely to be OK because you're getting paid soon to pay back. If it is just after a payday, it's likely to be problematic because you just got paid. Why do you need a loan? So when is your payday? Well, it can infer your payday based on all kinds of things, the type of job you have, where you live, and things like that. So it's all magically in the network. It's not absolutely right. It's wrong some of the time. But these weak features, and then my favorite one is the battery life. You would think it has absolutely no bearing on the person's trustworthiness. But apparently it does. If you think about it, conceivably, I don't know if this is why, conceivably people who keep running out of batteries are not as conscientious and trustworthy. Right? But also keep in mind, there are 3,000 features. Battery life is probably one of the least important ones, but nevertheless, the system takes into account 3,000 things and how they correlate with each other to come up with the maximum result. So it has strong things like income, rental, savings, whether you own properties and so on. And then it has all these weak ones. It adds it all together. No human can possibly do that.
I'd just like to point out that my battery is at 69%.
Okay.
In case you were...
So here's some
Oh,
money.
yeah, thank you very much. I will definitely pay you back tomorrow.
Actually, only in the United States can I do this. In China, we have no cash. Maybe we'll...
Yeah, if you just want to...
Well, do you want to get...
WeChat me.
Yeah.
Alipay me. That's okay, too.
We can get to that. Is that coming up, or should I explain that?
We're going to get to the China stuff in just a second. Actually,
right.
I want to do one more
We'll follow
thing.
your outline.
So we're sort of setting the table here, like what AI is. But crucially, part of your book is about what AI is not. And so one of the fun things about growing up in the 70s and 80s was this incredible diet of science fiction that we got to grow up alongside. And obviously, Silicon Valley people are never prone to kind of like fads and groupthink. We're all very individual thinkers with our own ideas. But it does seem to have been the case that lots of people in the Valley in recent years, and I won't name names, but Elon Musk is one of them, have painted a very dire picture of the implications if we take the kind of AI that you just described, the neural nets that sort of like bind together massive data sets to derive correlations and be able to answer questions. If we project that forward a couple more technical generations of exponential investment, growth, and advancement, they talk about either an event horizon where artificial intelligence will overwhelm human intelligence, a singularity where computers will become smarter than people. Your book argues that that is a flawed conception. Why? Why is that not likely to happen?
Right. The idea of singularity is basically based on when you read newspapers, are we not seeing rapidly more and more news about AI doing Go, solving cancer, beating humans at speech recognition? The past year has been accelerating news. And if you believe that accelerating news are correlated to accelerating technology breakthroughs, then singularity means exponentially. One day you'll suddenly wake up and realize, a year ago there was one breakthrough. Half a year ago there were 10 breakthroughs. Last month there were 100 breakthroughs. Today I wake up and I'm controlled by machines. But that idea is, well, I think that's the nature of exponentials. But the flaw in that argument is that there's fundamental technology as well as applications exponentially growing. But actually, the underlying technology is just deep learning. And they're being exponentially or rapidly, increasingly adapted for different domains. So we're seeing news like that, but underlying is just one technology. It's like if I were to invent, let's say we didn't have electricity, and suddenly magic happened, we had an electrical grid. And you're going to see, electrical iron, electrical computer, electrical cars go up like that. But it doesn't mean electricity is going to take over the world. So technology-wise, deep learning is the single huge breakthrough in the 62 years of AI history. And it was invented 10 years ago. And there hasn't been another invention of equivalent impact. So I think to project such exponential increase is not consistent with the data that we've seen. And also, just if you go and read all the papers now, no engineer would have any idea how to solve any of the problems that the systems have today. I mentioned it's limited in that it's only a single domain, and it has to be objective answer. So things like common sense, cross-domain thinking, strategic thinking, creativity are definitely absent. The ability to do complex planning is absent, and certainly self-awareness and emotion, we're nowhere to how to program that. And each of these will require 1 or 2 or 3 breakthroughs. So we're many breakthroughs away. I don't exclude the future possibility. There might be a day when machines exceed us, but we need to see a lot more progress, and we're nowhere near. I think I'm pretty confident in saying in 20 years, 30 years, there would not be singularity.
Whew. On behalf of the audience. Let's turn then to the China part of the story. So your book makes one factual observation that I think is very important for Americans to get. It will not be news to many of the people in this room, but we'll talk about it. And then it also makes a claim. So the factual observation is that China is no longer a copycat economy.
Right.
It is no longer a country that grows its technology sector by looking at the rest of the world and then doing kind of pale knockoff versions for China. The claim is that what China has become is a place uniquely well positioned to be able to lead in at least 3 of the 4 areas of AI, and generally to drive the world forward from the perspective of AI. And so let's talk about those 2 things in sequence. So first of all, China's internet sector is, you refer to it as kind of like a unique ecosystem, a distinct ecosystem, different from the United States, and no longer driven by copycat innovation. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it's like there?
Yeah, sure. I think the stigmatism about copycatting is causing Americans to not see that you can begin a copycat and become an innovator. Just because in the US that never happens, it doesn't mean it can't happen. After all, when we learn music and art, don't we start by copycatting? And then with more practice, we come up with our own ideas. That's what happened in China. 10, 15 years ago, there were absolute copycats. There was the Google of China, Amazon of China, and so on. But as the market rapidly expanded, and then massive capital flowed into China because everyone saw in this very fast market where mobile usage was increasing, it's a great place for investment. And in fact, the VC funds like ours have produced outsized returns. So with massive amount of money feeding into entrepreneurs who used to be copycats, imagine what happens, right? You have maybe, let's say you have another great idea, let's say Groupon. This happened about 8 years ago. And a bunch of Chinese entrepreneurs said, well, let's do a Chinese Groupon. And then, but we've learned a lot. We can innovate new ideas and make it better on top of Groupon. So in order for you to succeed, you are in a class of 5,000 Groupon copycats. So that's what happened 8 years ago. And there's really only one way to win, and that is to make your version of Groupon uncopyable. And from that evolved China's formula for innovation, entrepreneurship, and value creation. So how does that work? I'll give you an example. The American Groupon, now worth a couple of $1 billion in market cap, maybe a lot less in enterprise value, but the Chinese version of Groupon is now $55 billion IPO. And what happened? It's not just how large the market is, it's what the entrepreneur has chosen to do. When you're surrounded in an environment of tenacious entrepreneurs who are not afraid to copy, you must build a very high wall that no one can climb over. So Meituan CEO Wang Xing managed to basically change the way Chinese people eat. So it's a lot more daring than a Yelp or a Groupon. Those nicely added to the way we eat. But Wang Xing, the Meituan CEO, decided he would change the way Chinese people eat. He wants people to do food delivery, food ordering from home, and instead of cooking or going out. So he found out what it would take to do that. If you could deliver to, let's say, 500 million of the 800 million Chinese internet users within 30 minutes from the time of order, including cooking, the hot food to the home, and that delivery cost no more than 70 cents, then he could break even. So that's what he was faced up against. Most entrepreneurs say, that's crazy. 70 cents, how, even with Chinese salaries and urban density, how do you do it? Well, how did he do it? He just chipped away at it over 5 years. Every month chipped away 1 or 2 cents, 3 or 5 cents, eventually got to the 70 cents. And the way he ended up was he had to manage an army of 600,000 electrical moped riders. And he had to, because they're cheap, well, 70 cents per delivery. So the salaries have to be low, yet the service has to be good. So how do you train these people? And then also the mopeds run out of battery. How do you replace the battery? And then there's routing algorithm and AI, of course. So building this kind, and also you're burning VC money, right? All of this stuff is burning VC money. When I told you earlier about the loan app of the million applicants and the 100,000 defaulted on the loan, so how do you get that data? VC giving them the money, and then it gets lost. And then you get training data. Then for the next million, you don't lose so much. So that's what Wang Xing did. He raised several $billion to perfect this system. And eventually, he built the best, amazing, Uber-like delivery network for food to the home. And he shaved it down to 70 cents after years and years of trying. What was the downside and risk if he hadn't succeeded? Suppose he could only get down to 1.70, $1.70 per order. Well, he has 25 million orders a day, so he'd be losing $25 million a day had he not done that. So this is the Chinese entrepreneurism. It is the tenacity, the work ethic, the competitiveness, the winner take all, and do whatever it takes to erect such a high wall that your product becomes uncopyable. Now, you could say that's not innovative, but actually, if I offer the service to you, you take it, right? You'd say, wow, that's amazing. I never realized I could get the service. So it is an innovative product at the end, but it wasn't derived by a light bulb going off. It was derived by incredible hard work, risk-taking, tenacity.
Yeah, leaving, entirely apart from the AI parts of your book, actually, the chapters which describe the kind of innovation economy in China make this book, worth reading in and of themselves. I love that part of the book. The contrast that you draw is between Silicon Valley companies that valorize sort of originality of idea, frown upon copying in any way, shape, or form, and where the VCs keep their eyes especially attuned to companies that will have tremendous amounts of leverage. In other words, the thinnest possible company that will apply technology to solve an information problem and create a ton of value. So Uber, for example, an app with a back end and some customer support and no cars, right? By contrast, you show how Didi in China is buying gas stations and buying repair facilities, where the company that does short-term apartment listings, the name of which I'm forgetting, is providing services like cleaning and restocking. And so in China, the hyper-competitive atmosphere means that, and different labor dynamics mean that to build a moat around your business, you do the gritty, grungy, brick-and-mortar business type activities in order to build a full vertical stack. Silicon Valley companies don't do that. And so very often when they come to China, try to replicate the American model that's worked over here, they get crushed. We've seen that with Amazon, with eBay, with Yahoo, with Google, to some extent with Microsoft. And so one of the things then that I think is interesting is you draw a contrast between market-driven entrepreneurship in China, mission-driven entrepreneurship in the US. Can you say a little bit about like the roots of that kind of culturally and why it is that Chinese entrepreneurs are so good at that?
Yeah, well, China is a market where user need becomes the source of working hard in innovation, solving the user problem. And the Chinese entrepreneurs come from a background, imagine single child, even though that policy's changed, but people in their 30s are likely to be a single child who has huge expectations from his or her 2 parents and 4 grandparents that he or she will take care of the 6 of them. And that they tell him, you're the first generation in the last 10 or 20 generations that has a chance because you went to college or you went to US and got a PhD. Now you've got to go do this. You got to be the Jack Ma. You got to do this. There's a pressure. There's also the Deng Xiaoping about 40 years ago basically opened up China for market economy, and he said, let some people get rich first. Right? That was in sharp contrast with the system before. And now you can imagine 1.3 billion people all want to be that some people who get rich first, fearing that if you fell behind, you might not be the fortunate. So it's under those conditions that people have the work ethic they have, the tenacity they have. And also the Chinese education is more about rote learning. So a Steve Jobs, like let's say someone had Steve Jobs' DNA, was born in China, it's likely that they would not be given the freedom to think different and drop out of college and start a company. Instead, he might become an outlier. So it is a completely different culture and background that led to this, type of entrepreneurism.
So in China, then, we've got these market-driven entrepreneurs. These are some of the ingredients that you lay out. Another key one is mobile-first users. So basically, the country had desktops and laptops, but in very small numbers relative to the population. The smartphone, and especially the cheap Android smartphone, really becomes the default computing device. You have a single super app, WeChat, that pulls together many different services, provides an ecosystem, dense cities, cheap labor, a mobile payment system, a government-backed culture shift that you just described. So all of these ingredients put together then make China a place that has entrepreneurs and incredible amounts of data. And building on that is a Chinese advantage in artificial intelligence.
Exactly. So we talk all about, in the book, I talk about the entrepreneurship and the companies built and the culture, because to build a great AI company at this point, think about all the things I told you about AI. What do you need? Well, you need a lot of data, and China has so much data. So in the age of AI, I often talk about data is the new oil, and China is the new Saudi Arabia. So China has all the data, not only more people, but more depth, because so many services are digitized. You're riding a shared bicycle, ordering food, and so on and so forth. So a lot of data. China has entrepreneurs, and AI gets better with data. So the entrepreneur process is you start with an idea, you try it out. If it doesn't work, you pivot. But with AI, you pivot with the data. So if it works, you get more data. Then it works better, you get even more data. So that's what happened with the loan example I gave. Right? First, they have some handwritten rules that had 20% default rate, lost a bunch of money. Then they trained a system that had 15% default rate, lost a bunch more money. Then they trained up another system based on that data, then it has 10% default rate. And now the default rate is 3%. And now it's making massive money. And it comes from iteration of not only the product to be a better user fit, but also the iterative gathering of data to make the AI more robust. Similarly, if you were to do autonomous vehicles, if you launch faster, you collect more data, that's arguably to your favor. So the Chinese entrepreneurs are tenacious, they work very hard, they are very fast, they collect a lot of data, they get going. They don't need the final vision. They first get something going and collect more data and let it blossom. So a last point I'll make is that because deep learning is the technology, it's been invented for 10 years, there are a lot of people who know how to use it. It's no longer in the laboratories. It's no longer held in the minds of few, like in the days of Manhattan Project in Enrico Fermi. Only he and a small number of people can do this. AI is known by millions of people throughout the world. And China has so many engineers and students eager to get in. The entry barrier is not as high as you think, especially unless you're doing autonomous vehicle or something really, really fancy. So AI has shifted from the era of discovery and invention to the era of implementation.
One of the nice, I think, analogies that you use to that shift is to electricity. So electricity, the harnessing of electricity is a major discovery.
Yeah.
And then the economic growth for about 100 years is people finding ways to stick electricity into every single part of human life.
Right.
And that's not Nobel Prize winning scientists. No. In your terms in the book, those are tinkerers.
That's right. And AI is faster than electricity because you don't need to build an electrical grid. There's already cloud, Amazon Cloud, Google Cloud, Alibaba Cloud, that have AI on it. So tinkerers can start to tinker right now, even only after 2 or 3 years after the technologies become available on the cloud.
So the data is an advantage. The people that China has and their sort of work ethic, orientation, training, and so forth are an advantage. Another sort of third pillar of advantage that you call out is that for some of the kinds of benefits that we want to be able to derive from AI, a top-down government that is willing to absorb risk with a long-term view will have an advantage. And so, for example, in the case of autonomous vehicles, in this country, people freak out when there's an accident, and you see a lot of reaction, and there's both a legal culture and maybe a kind of like a risk-averse maturity in our culture that says autonomous vehicles are going to have to be like perfect before we're going to let them on our streets. Whereas in China, the kinds of infrastructure investments that could enable AI can be both dictated by the government and short-term risk can be absorbed in the interest of what is clearly going to be a safer street when autonomous vehicles predominate.
Right, absolutely. I think if one wants autonomous vehicles to be perfect before they can be launched, then there will never be autonomous vehicles. Because as I described, data is gathered iteratively. So more data improves the algorithms, gives feedback to the scientists who build better products. It's got to be an iterative loop. Now, we obviously have some minimal requirement, whether it's in US or China. If the vehicle drives worse than people, we should not let it out on the streets. But if it's better than people, well, I mean, one could debate whether it needs to be 1% better than people or 10%. That's a reasonable discussion. But if you want it to be perfect, then that country that demands perfect autonomous vehicle will lose in the technological race because it's the iterative approach that will work. But there needs to be some degree of minimal responsibility. That's kind of the first point. But the other way is, I think Chinese government actually lets the private enterprises invest in companies to build the products. But Chinese government will go in to do public infrastructure investments that no private company can do. For example, China is building a new city called Xiong'an, which is the size of Chicago, designed for autonomous vehicle. The downtown of Xiong'an has 2 layers. Pedestrians, pets, and bicycles are on top, and vehicles on the bottom. So that will eliminate the likelihood of a car hitting pedestrian, the worst kind of accidents. And the Zhejiang province is building a highway with sensors designed to hint to autonomous vehicles to avoid accidents. The city of Suzhou, this came out after my book, came out with a 2-layer, 10 square kilometer space where on top are the human drivers, bottom is the autonomous driver. It's kind of cleverly designed because one of the issues, including the Tesla accident, was a result of lighting. AI with this camera may not see things in the right color because of lighting. So if you essentially put the autonomous driver in a basement that's consistently lit, then there's less variation, can get it going. So you're almost seeing, well, first we're seeing Chinese government putting huge amount of dollars into this infrastructure building. And secondly, we're sort of seeing local governments are sort of like entrepreneurs trying new ideas, well-informed entrepreneurs. We don't know which one will be the best, but I think that's the kind of spirit we'll see moving this forward. There are some people who would still say, is this government giving help to advantage China against other countries? I would argue it's not dissimilar from President Eisenhower, who put in the interstate highway, which is the public infrastructure that pushed America forward.
You know, as I feel compelled as an American to at least point out that there is, like, to take the Zhejiang example, you know, there is some risk, which your book acknowledges, by the way, that, you know, for example, if Zhejiang builds a sensor-laden, radio frequency-enabled highway, will it be the right standards? Will the sensors be out of date in 2 years? You know, who knows? Maybe the companies absorb it and adopt it or not. There are some risks to top-down.
Yes.
Let me just challenge you on sort of one thing, and then I want to reserve a couple of minutes to talk about the jobs threat that you identify. But let me press you on one point. Chinese companies have been notoriously bad at succeeding outside China. And one of the things that your book points out is that the core advantages that it has to produce better AI, produce better products, produce better and faster, more efficient uses of AI to serve people. Isn't it possible that the advantages that China has over American companies operating in China will be handicaps when those Chinese companies try to, for example, understand a Belgian loan market? Is there something about AI that makes it so synthetic and abstract that it's easily exportable, or do you think Chinese companies will have to really up their game, struggle, learn how to succeed in Brazil or China, because the things that they've learned how to do in China are just as inapplicable as Brazil as you know, eBay was in China 10 years ago?
Right. So first, China is such a large market. Most Chinese companies just focus on the Chinese market. It's too much extra work and opportunity cost to go to external markets. So far, we largely see China just in China, and the US companies go elsewhere, and some markets accept US technology, some develop their own. But I will also say this is changing, because after all, the China market saturation is close. So top Chinese companies are looking at how to expand. But they've studied the American cases, where the American single platform approach didn't quite provide the right perfect answer for all the markets. And China experienced it itself. And it also tried to take you know, WeChat abroad, Baidu search abroad, not with a lot of success. So I think the collective recognition in China is that the large giants, Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, Didi, Toutiao, they would not necessarily expand themselves overseas, but partner overseas. So Alibaba is investing externally, Southeast Asia, India, and Didi is actually investing. And when they invest, they also inject technology. For example, there are some countries which have local share riding apps that are losing to Uber, but when Didi invested in them, Didi also gave them the app technology, the look and feel, the route finding, and the AI behind it to help the so-called local insurgents have a chance against the American leaders. So I think that's going to be one approach. Another approach is there are still some purely digital services that don't require local partnership, and companies like ByteDance or Toutiao are expanding to other markets. So I'm seeing an increasing number of Chinese companies, whether through investing and injecting technology or going directly, or actually copy from China. That is, Chinese companies are awkward when they try to copy an American technology to Brazil, but copying a Chinese technology by another company to Brazil is a lot easier. So, because it's well known, it's inherent, you use it every day. So generally speaking, I think going 5 years in the future, I think America will continue to dominate. You gave Belgium as an example. I think US will continue to dominate Europe, basically developed countries. US, Europe, English-speaking countries, Japan. I think China's going to have a really good shot at Southeast Asia, possibly India, probably Islamic countries, especially Middle East, and definitely Africa. So we're going to sort of see the world in two parallel universes, with Chinese expanding beyond mainland China. But China's expansion to other countries will not be as strong an ownership as Google or Facebook has in Europe. It would be through some investments, partnerships, technology injections.
So your book ends on a fairly dire note. I mean, a hopeful note, but a fairly dire note about the challenge that is about to hit.
Yeah.
And that challenge is that AI products are going to be able to do lots and lots of things that humans have been doing better than those humans, cheaper, more reliably, more accurately. And you cite a range of estimates for how many decades we've got before the big disruptions hit and how many people's job categories will be replaceable. You are on the more pessimistic or optimistic, I'm not even sure which way to say it, depending on whether I'm speaking for the Star Trek computer or myself. But you believe that much of the analysis is focused on task-specific jobs and figuring out what AI will be able to do better. You believe that we are underestimating the industry-wide disruptions that can happen where a new technique like the loan company can kind of completely replace the way that an industry has been doing business by applying AI. And so there's probably a lot to say about that. I want to save some time for questions, but part of the way that you analyze that problem is different because of your personal experience with lymphoma.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit of the story of
Sure.
how that hit you and what that taught you about how we can deal with AI.
Sure. So first, let me talk about why I think there's an issue, and then how we might solve it with my lymphoma story in the middle. So why am I more pessimistic that more jobs will get displaced? Because as we discussed, AI is about a single task intelligence system that can take care of one task, a repetitive routine task. But if we think about not people in this room, but on the whole earth, what percentage of people do single repetitive tasks or scripts of multiple tasks, each of which is repetitive and routine? We'll probably come to the conclusion that's a fairly large number. And I'm not a disbeliever in human AI symbiosis. I think there are creative jobs, professional jobs, jobs such as scientists, columnists, writers, lawyers, that will become better because of AI. The AI plus the creative or the professional will do things better than either can do. I'm a huge believer in that. But after all, that is definitely not most of the world's population. So the number of jobs that are non-creative, non-strategic, and repetitive routine is significant. And as AI gets to do them, business people will be forced to make the trade-off. Do I retain my employees and risk getting killed by my competitor, or do I automate and then deal with the workforce reduction? So that is the premise. And then where would this 50% or 40% of the people go? What jobs will they take on is the question. That's the first part. Then the lymphoma story was 5 years ago. I have been sort of a machine, workaholic, working extremely hard. Maybe my job is not so routine, but it's kind of machine-like and repetitive because I wanted to make a big difference to the world, and I became a workaholic. I would wake up twice a night to answer email. When you were emailing me from Mountain View,
Don't think I didn't notice.
I would wake up automatically at 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. almost every night and answer all my email so that my American colleagues were feeling I was responsive, and then my Chinese employees would feel that they have to work hard too. That is the Chinese work ethic we talked about that's leading to China's rise in technology and AI. That's, I think, what a lot of us in the room, as well as a lot of routine job workers, feel about workaholism, that the meaning of our lives is equated with our job. And it was after the basically the week after I found I had lymphoma, after I've had my going through the phase of denial, why me, making my deal with God, writing my will, then I came to realize that my life was, had my priorities all upside down. That in the whatever remaining days that I had, continuing to work was no longer something I wanted to do. That much more important was loving the people I love, giving back love to the people who loved me, and pursuing things that I'm passionate about. It's not about working harder, making more money, becoming more famous. And it was that realization and that process that got me to think, so when aren't these routine job workers in the same state that I am in, that we were all brainwashed by the Industrial Revolution value that our work equals the meaning of our life. And perhaps AI is a wake-up call for us to realize that there is something else. Maybe it's about love, compassion, empathy, human-to-human relations. And that if I could imagine our maker could be very frustrated with us, that after thousands of years of evolution, we're still stuck here like rats running on a wheel, doing the routine same jobs every day, and not spending time on what we're passionate about, spending more time with the people we love, thinking about the meaning of life, but just thinking it's all work, work, work. So maybe our maker is so frustrated that he threw AI at us that to take away all the routine jobs so we have time to think and to love. And that also gave me a possible resolution to the job losses. That is, are there possibly enough jobs that are compassionate or empathetic or people-to-people interaction so as to retrain and absorb the workforce that might be displaced? So if we think about jobs like elderly care, nurses, nannies, these are the perfect compassionate jobs, empathetic jobs, and we sure need a lot more of them. Think about elderly care. People over 80 need 5 times as much care. A lot of AI scientists are trying to invent robots to take care of older people, but think how mean that is. Would you, when you get older, or your parents, really want that? I had an entrepreneur who built a robot to take care of elderly, and then the only function that was used was customer service. The person would click on it and say, how come my kids aren't here? You know, or let me tell you about my grandkids. So elderly people don't want a robot, they want people. And then there are a million elderly care jobs not filled in the US for the simple reason that it's not paid well. So if we believe that AI will generate all this wealth, and some Silicon Valley people think we should give $20,000 to everybody and be done with it, I think it's much too simplistic. I think, why don't we not give it to everybody? Why don't we take that wealth, whether it's taxed or however generated, and subsidize elderly care, subsidize teachers to increase the student-teacher ratio. As AI takes over the routine parts of a teacher's job, as AI starts to diagnose for the doctor, they can be more empathetic, compassionate. They might need a different kind of training. We can afford to have 10 times more teachers, 10 times more doctors, and there would be a lot of jobs. You might think, well, how could someone doing a routine job be trained to be a doctor? Well, in 20 or 30 years, when the diagnosis is all done by the AI, the doctor is really just the human interface of dealing with the patient, teasing out the issues, family history, making the patient feel better, and giving the patient the confidence. And for that, you don't need a 10-year training, maybe more like a nurse practitioner. So if we think that way, and also teachers, why can't, we actually are, there will be a 60-minute segment on our work with AI and education in either next Sunday or the Sunday after that. It's about a lot of the teacher's job is routine, grading homework, giving exams, giving the same lecture over and over again. If we take that out and let AI or MOOC take care of that, maybe teachers can become more mentors on one-on-one and giving help. And if that happens, we can have a lot more teachers. And if that happens, maybe we should pay people, parents, who choose to homeschool their kids. So these are probably a lot more meaningful ways to spend all the wealth that we collectively make in AI to make the empathetic jobs more meaningful, better paid, and also to help retrain the displaced routine workers who can move on to those.
Well,
Thank you.
Perfect next end. Let's take some questions from the audience. And while we're raising hands and delivering a mic to somebody, I'll just note that the policy wonk in me, my ears perk up when I hear you say that, because to me what that says is we're going to need to do steeply progressive taxation of people that are accumulating an ever increasing share of wealth in order to subsidize socially good activities for which there is not currently a viable private employer, which is very interesting. Yeah, so let's just go with a hand that I see here through the lights. There's a mic coming for you right here. If you will pronounce your question into the mic.
Yes, you say that there's nothing to fear about computers taking over because there hasn't been a breakthrough. What I say is that we don't need the breakthrough. What will happen is the computers will evolve. We ought to use genetic algorithms and probably more powerful algorithms. I'm not a computer scientist. But the way life evolved by just simple chemicals developing ways of self-reproducing, the computers eventually will be able to do that. It just requires more computer power. And then take advantage of the facts of how addictive humans are. Just look at the street, how people are totally unaware, and the way food companies develop food products to addict people. So I think eventually computers will be able to do that without an additional breakthrough. They will create their own breakthrough by evolution. What do you think?
Okay, I don't agree. Well, the current computer algorithms are just dumb tools. I mean, they're really smart in that they're better than us in making loans and all that stuff, but we give it the objective function on which they optimize. I think you can be imaginative and say, can there possibly be some day that they can evolve or self-replicate? But that day hasn't come, and it will be a breakthrough when someone can cross the line and say, this program is now reinventing itself and getting smarter and smarter. Media isn't helping this at all. Some of you probably read, Facebook Labs came up with a new human language because the robots are talking to each other and they're evolving. But that's just a bug.
So, second question right down in the front row.
For those of us who remember Star Trek, we used to say that space is the next frontier. But for we Earthlings, the next frontier is mapping the brain. And that's what's going on today. Behind the scenes, money is being committed to it on a long-term basis. And the interplay between artificial intelligence and mapping the brain and what we will discover is possible, which we know very little about today, presents us with an ethical challenge, a cultural challenge, an institutional challenge, which will go to supplement a lot of the problems with artificial intelligence, but which will cause more problems because we haven't got the guidelines, and we won't do that for a long period of time. But there are people in this country, the young, the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds, the early 40-year-olds, who are working progressively on this issue of mapping the brain, and they're coming up with not very much at this point, as you did 20 years ago or 25 years, but it's there, and it's going to be done, and it's going to have the greatest effect on what we did, just as we did with our blood cells and our genomes. Mm-hmm. This is going to be the next frontier and will challenge the interplay between the human being and the machine. And there's already problems that I could discuss on that basis at this time, but that's your next frontier, and it's dramatic, and it's going to be consequential.
Thank you. I think that is a possible scenario, but as you said, we don't yet know how mapping the brain and AI will or will not lead to the breakthrough. So to the extent it does, They're big issues. Personally, I would say CRISPR is probably a bigger concern. That's similar. And there are many other areas. I understand. Yeah, I think AI plus other things can lead to all kinds of danger. I was talking to Andrew, when I talked to Andrew earlier, I was referring to this super intelligent cyborg emerging through singularity as an unlikely or impossible event. I do think regulating the combinations of brain breakthroughs, CRISPR breakthroughs, or if someone comes up with what the previous gentleman said, self-writing programs, when those breakthroughs happen, they may raise other threats or challenges. Also think security is a big problem. People could hack into autonomous vehicles and turn them into killer weapons. So I think there are lots of dangers beyond the job one. I think they haven't quite materialized, but I think we should get ahead of the game and start to study them.
Okay, so the enterprise computer, not likely to happen. C-3PO and R2-D2, still a long ways off. Is AI going to help me get my jetpack?
Get your...
My jetpack. I still don't have the jetpack that I grew up expecting by the time I was this
I
age.
see, from the start.
Let's do a question over here on the left.
But you know, there's already holodeck and all that stuff, right? I mean, when I go to work, my face opens the door, right? And then we're talking to Alexa more and more. So a lot of those non-super intelligent AI things in Star Trek are happening, and autonomous vehicles are happening. So I think they will.
Dr. Lee, you mentioned the complementary sort of capabilities of the US and China in AI. Discovery is American, the American forte, implementation is Chinese. Now, the prospects of cooperation in the current environment are sort of, it's unthinkable. But if we set aside the politics, just from the perspective of sort of, the theory of comparative advantage, I mean, are there some industries and sectors where the two countries can sort of, leverage their complementary skills and cooperate? So not military, but say healthcare or some of these other areas. You talked about these qualities of compassion and empathy and understanding. I mean, is there a scenario of the two taking advantage of their complementary strengths and cooperating?
Yes, I agree. I think at the theoretical level, it's extremely complementary. If we pick some really hard problem, I think the simple honestly, I think for the simple AI problems, the bank loans and the big data, the internet, the Chinese companies can run really fast. They don't need much help. But for the tougher problems, cancer, autonomous vehicle, and things like that, if somehow we could construct the best of the American top researcher and the top fastest of the Chinese implementer, we can deliver solutions much faster. But that's theoretical. In practice, export control, CFIUS, and so on would probably make that an impossibility. But perhaps we can have hope that in healthcare and education, the two countries can look beyond whatever differences there are in the trade dispute and find a way to work together. I think in terms of not working together, but just watching each other, I think is another way to build complementarity. Part of the reason for writing this book is to show the Americans who want to build a company but aren't Steve Jobs. This is really saying there is another formula, another way to build a company, and study it, right? And I think in terms of the compassionate jobs, I think all countries can study each other. Korea in gifted education, we can study Japan and Switzerland for craftsmen as a profession, Canada and the Netherlands in volunteerism. So I think in terms of how to create the compassionate professions, all countries can learn from each other, and it's not necessary to build one entity. It's probably enough to just kind of watch and learn.
Let me just take a moderator's prerogative to impress you on one thing. So that optimistic scenario, the one where the different approaches of the different nations can be brought together, countries can work together. Much of the, I think, wave of fear that people have about AI has something to do with the sense that people in positions of power around the world really have not proven themselves able to be trusted with the kind of power that these technologies can bring. Thuggishness, I see a lot of it in this country, zero-sum game mentality, xenophobia, racism, misogyny. People with those kinds of values, given the power of AI to make decisions about others, leaves you fairly fearful. I've been reading a lot recently about kind of military uses of AI, and there's the 1,000 drone swarm scenario that, under any radar's ability to detect, can send a force into a country and destroy a base, a missile silo, a plane, assassinate people. Do you see some reason for hope in AI's, or maybe to say this somewhat differently, people's ability and our ability to educate people in values like love and commonality of purpose and loyalty and so forth? Can we get the world into a position faster than AI can get into a position, to do good with AI faster than AI will get into a position to be misused?
I think it's the only thing we can do, but I'm not sure it's that's sufficient to avoid any of the problems that you mentioned. I think doing all those things certainly will help, and I think countries, I think actually we almost should view this as a crowdsourcing problem, because the problems are too many. And it's not just AI, it's AI and CRISPR and cognitive science and all these other things. The problems are too many. We should almost crowdsource and let all the countries try different things and then learn from each other. I think, obviously UN is not powerful enough to regulate the whole world in each country. Every country is now somewhat aware of some of these problems. And for example, Europe has come up with GDPR for privacy protection. While I don't think it's a very good solution, it's at least a step forward and we can learn from it. I don't really have any good answer to this one. If I did, I'd put it in the book. Maybe it's my next book.
Right,
maybe we write the next one together.
Okay.
Thank you. Kai-Fu, as we look at the things that AI cannot do now, as you mentioned earlier, cross-domain, complex planning, self-awareness, emotion, as AI begins to approach these capabilities, do you think the US and China will continue to advance in the ways they've in the past, the US taking the discovery route, China taking the implementation route, or do you think the roles might get switched along the way or shared?
Okay. So first, the premise is that we would make breakthrough on these areas. And I think in some of them, I'm somewhat optimistic. In cross-domain thinking, strategy, planning, I do think we'll make progress. Things like self-awareness and emotion, I think it becomes a philosophical problem, whether we believe the sanctity of our soul or that the human can be completely replicated. So we're not going to get into that discussion here. But anyway, answering your question about the advances, I would fully expect US to stay at the forefront of research for the foreseeable future. And I think if there were more funding, if there were more open immigration for top minds to the US, that advantage is going to be very hard for any country to surpass, because it's a combination of already existing great universities and research systems. It's a country with a culture of free thinking, and it's a magnet that attracts a disproportionate number of high IQ people to come to the US, and many of whom will stay. So it's a self-sustaining ecosystem. But in order for this to work, the pipeline of people coming in cannot be cut off. I think that's kind of the long-term danger there might be. But even if small mistakes happen, I think US is bound to be ahead in the area of discovery for 1 or 2 decades to come, if not longer.
Does anybody have a question that can be answered in 3 minutes? All right, let's go to the, just because of the way the lighting here is, I'm going to go with the hands I can see. So the woman in the, yeah.
Kai-Fu, nice to see you again. I wonder if you could talk briefly about, there's a lot of political noise, obviously, between US and China now with tariffs and other things. And President Trump has said that China 2025 is a threat to America. I think you do a very good job of translating the differences between China and the US in business. Could you translate that politically? Because I think last I checked, you actually have more Twitter followers than the President of the United States.
No.
Not anymore?
Never did. never did. Yeah, so about the various China state plans, I think there's a belief that the Chinese government is one entity, and it just puts a lot of money in Chinese companies and gives them an unfair advantage against American companies. And on top of their IP issues. But I want to clarify that I didn't study the 2025 plan in a lot of detail. I studied the AI plan, 2030 plan, in a lot of detail. It's fairly well written. It sets audacious goals, but it in itself didn't give money to any companies. China's AI, so I can only speak on AI again. China's entire success so far in AI has been privately funded. We've created 5 unicorns. None of them have received government funding. I think there may be a new round that some of them may have it, but I think up to now, their joint total market valuation is $21 billion US dollars. And it's all privately funded. In fact, it's largely funded by American money. You know, our LPs are American pension funds, and then we take that money and when you fund them. So we're making lots of money for you guys. But what is the role of the government? The government plays, I think, 3 very important roles. The first is that those documents, especially the AI plan, sets a tone. So once the tone is set, a bank is much more likely to buy AI software and pay for it. A local government is much more likely to build those 2-layer roads. So that tone is important, but it's not ordered down. Each city and each bank can make its own decisions. The second thing the Chinese government does very effectively is infrastructure building, which I've covered, like in the smart highways. And the third area, I think, is the general approach to what in the book I call techno-utilitarian policy, which means a little bit contrary to the gentleman in the front. The Chinese approach is let these new technologies blossom. We will watch them closely. And when things don't look right, we'll regulate it. If things really don't look right, we'll stop it. And that is something I think a strong government can do. As an example, I was going to get to why I have no money in China. China permitted 2 large companies to basically eradicate cash and credit cards over the last 3 years. It's phenomenal. In America, there would probably be all kinds of lobbying, disagreeing, concerns about whether software companies can be trusted with the money or can only banks and credit card companies, all that. So government basically said, new technology, looks like a good thing. Let's watch it. 6 months later, okay, still looks good, keep going. Then it took over, and then there's no cash and no credit cards. But it doesn't mean the government doesn't interfere. In the cryptocurrency, the government sort of watched it for a while and said, whoa, wait a minute, there are these village ladies buying ICOs. That's not going to work. So the government banned cryptocurrency and ICOs. So that's the techno-utilitarian approach. I'm not arguing it's good or bad, right and wrong. I'm just describing it as an alternate way of policy, and it seems effective on mobile, internet, and AI.
Well, it's time for us to wrap up. I'm going to wrap up with just one question for you to maybe speculate about. So one of the, I've invested in a couple of companies recently that are trying to use AI to try to persuade people to vote for Democrats. And it's, it's something that I think I need to do, but I'm not thrilled about its implications for democracy broadly. In other words, the science of persuasion is built on a notion that we have kind of open deliberative discourse and that people can go through reasoned arguments. I'm not sure that the kind of technology that uses AI to figure out how to precisely target messages based on non-demographic characteristics like loyalty or a belief in equality or fairness or whatever, I'm not sure that's so great. Could you speculate if a country wanted to foster like kind of a healthy society, a healthy public domain, a healthy public discourse, how would that country be putting AI to work today?
Gosh.
And this is, by the way, a 2-minute question.
Okay. I think for a country to think about using AI tools, I think the country better start first with using AI to listen, to gather input, because that seems a lot more innocuous than using AI to brainwash, essentially.
Do you think the kind of education uses of AI can produce people that can't just get better grades, but also can be like better citizens? Is there some reason to think that those two things could be correlated? Or not?
Yeah, so we actually invest in a lot in AI in education, and we haven't gone to the depth of using AI to promote creativity or breakthrough thinking. What we have done is use AI to make students learn their normal courseware much faster. So they have, students in China are very poor. They spend a lot more time studying. It's the same 996 crazy studying hours to get crammed into the best school. So the AI use has let them get good grades without spending, until midnight every night studying. So that gave them some time back. So I think it's up to the parents who need to wisely give that few hours given back to the students to guide their kids into critical thinking.
All right, and on that note, let me say thank you to the Asia Society, and please join me in thanking Kai-Fu. Thanks for a great book.
Thanks very much.